Well, howdy, folks. When we last left your heroes, we had made collectively as humanity the dumbest decision we'd have ever made, which was to launch into World War One, which becomes the fountainhead of the rise of Nazism, the rise of communism, the rise of fascism, World War Two, the communist revolution in Russia, the Cold War. There's an awful lot of stuff that we could undo in history if we could go back and save the life of Franz Ferdinand. But alas, it happened. And so today, last video we talked a little bit about the road to World War One. Today we're going to talk about what the war was really like. So how did the war go, militarily speaking? Before we get into like the succession of battles or what have you, I want to mention how dramatically different World War One was than any war that had preceded it. You had a rapid. Remember, like we've talked about before, how civilization in 1800 and civilization in 1900 are two very, very different things technologically speaking. The Industrial Revolution has been well in full force for 125 years now. Give or take, maybe even a little further back than that. But things are a lot more complex technologically in 1914 than they had been the last time Europe had a major general war. We called it World War One. It was because it involved so many of their imperial possessions and so forth. But it wasn't the first time all of Europe had been at war. 30 Years' War, War of Spanish Succession, War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War. You can go on. But obviously the thing that's different now is that by now all of Africa, Asia, etc. had been conquered by the Europeans, and then the Americas get involved as well. So the last time we've really had major great power conflict, though, in Europe, the technology was just different than it was by 1914. Because over the course of World War One, you have a number of things that are introduced to warfare, or at least perfected. The first thing I want to talk about is the machine gun. So it's not accurate to say this is the first time the machine gun was used. I mean, it was used in some of the colonial wars, the Boer War, and some things like that. You even see the Gatling gun, which is kind of the ancestor of the machine gun used in the American Civil War and some different things. But the machine guns that they had in 1914 were better than they had ever been. And that was probably one of the number one things that contributed to this just being a very different war. I mean, if you think about, literally, if you go back 100 years from World War One, back to the Napoleonic Wars, I mean, you've still got people having to, load the rifle, fire the shot, reload it, and fire the shot, reload it. And now, I mean, you got people who are just able to pull down on the trigger and aim. So obviously that's going to change, the calculus strategically quite a bit. So in addition to the invention of the machine gun, World War One is going to be the first war that involves air power. It's going to be a little while before air power is used in the contemporary way. We're kind of a couple years into the war before people really start using guns, really mounting guns on airplanes and really using them as really militarily valuable things. They originally start being used for reconnaissance and stuff like that, similar how the blimps and stuff like that were used in the Civil War and that kind of a thing. Eventually, originally there's a few isolated accounts from the early part of World War One of, they didn't have guns mounted on them and that kind of stuff. I mean, because remember, the airplane is like 10 years old when World War One gets started, 10, 12 years old, something like that. We're not far from the Wright brothers and Kitty Hawk at this point. So there's some accounts of World War One, people chucking wrenches out of the airplane and stuff like that because they don't have guns to shoot at people. The technological question of how you make a plane into a fighter plane is, these were these old, they were called biplanes and triplanes, which are the ones where they had like sets of wings, 2 or 3, and they were powered by propeller. It wasn't like a jet like today. So you had the propeller, and if you mounted a machine gun, the question was, how do you avoid shooting your propeller? Because if you shoot your propeller, you're out. So they had to kind of develop a way to kind of like figure that out, but they did. They created a trigger mechanism that kind of synced with the motion of the propeller or whatever. So you start to have the use of fighter planes in World War One. The most famous, and of course they started to give the title of ace to fighter pilots that were able to down a certain number of enemies. And the most famous ace of the war was Manfred von Richthofen, the German pilot known as the Red Baron. Perhaps you might associate him with Peanuts cartoons and or frozen pizza. But the Red Baron was able to kill 81 Allied planes in his day, which is by far the record for most confirmed kills in World War One aerial warfare. He was kind of almost treated as a hero even by the Allies in some weird way because people were so blown away by what he accomplished. He ultimately was killed by a shot fired from the ground. Australia and Canada argue over who nailed him. There's an Australian soldier and a Canadian soldier who both lay claim to it. But he ultimately is taken out by fire from beneath. But anyway, so the Red Baron, most famous of them, but the Aces, they kind of got this kind of Knight of the Air kind of sensibility about them. People kind of looked up to them in a kind of a different way because there was a certain sense of optimism or joy with the aerial stuff that it's very, very different from the nastiness that you see on the ground, which we'll talk about in great detail in a minute. So you got the machine gun, you got the airplane. The thing that is going to wind up bringing the United States into the war, and we'll talk about how that is the invention of the submarine. The Germans invent the submarine, which they called the U-boat, which is short for Unterseeboot. And so the U-boat was used, and it could go underneath the water, and so opposing ships wouldn't be able to see it. Its primary weapon was the torpedo. Then you have halfway through the war, we introduced the tank. And so the tank is, really comes into its own in World War II. World War II is going to be a very tank-heavy war. It's a lot of, World War II is much more mobile than World War I is. But World War I is going to see the introduction of the tank, kind of at the halfway mark. At the beginning of the war, there's some sporadic use of horses, which is kind of the last time that you really see that in a major war. Other than that one little isolated thing they made the movie about in Afghanistan. But for the most part, World War I is kind of the last war to have any involvement of the horse, although not much of it. But by the halfway point, you have the tank coming in. The tank was primitive, but still, you can imagine the first time that you were a soldier and you saw a tank coming for you, you'd never seen it before, what that must have been. One weapon that they had introduced around this time also was the flamethrower, and that was a pretty devastating one to use as well. They had invented, this was the first time they deployed a particular type of cannon known as the howitzer that used I want to say it's a parabolic arc. It's been a while since I took geometry. I can't remember if that's the right term, but it kind of goes like that. These are big, massive guns. So there was, and one of the nastiest one. This was also the first one where barbed wire could play a big role in it. But also one of the nastiest things was the introduction of poisonous gas. And you see a lot of pictures of World War I. You'll see soldiers wearing these old school gas masks. Some of y'all probably wish you had one now, right? But the reason for the gas mask was the Germans introduced this. The Allies got in on it too. We actually, Adolf Hitler actually nearly died of an Allied gas attack while fighting in World War I. We missed him by that much. We were that close to not having to deal with Hitler being a thing. But unfortunately, he survived. But so you have, so you've got gas. You've got tanks, you've got submarines, you've got airplanes, you've got machine guns, and nobody knows how to use any of this stuff. This is all kind of relatively new. So war's going to be very different, and it doesn't go at all the way the commanders thought. There's a kind of a tradition in military history of commanders frequently coming entirely prepared to win the last war, right? A lot of people are concerned now if America got into a major power war, how we would handle it, because we've spent years working on trying to develop ways to do urban street fighting in Middle Eastern environments and like in Iraq and that kind of thing, counterinsurgency type stuff. But we started kind of relying on old tactics before we kind of learned all that. So there's this tendency to everyone's always ready to win the war that you fought last. And that really is the case in World War I. People did not have adequate battle plans for how to deal with sending an army across, with all this new tech. And so what it turns into is ultimately it breaks down into this system of what they call trench warfare, where neither side can really get much ground. So they build these massive defensive trenches, just dig these big trenches. The German ones were pretty sophisticated, had electricity, all this stuff. The British and French ones were a little bit more primitive because they thought the war was going to be over quicker. That turned out to be a bad mistake because a lot of times their soldiers had to deal with more stuff because of that. But these trenches would kind of provide some defensive positioning until the commander got brave, and he'd send over the command to do what they call going over the top, which is where you would just basically send your people out into just a hail of machine gun fire and get massacred. And so we have large amounts of time. This is more germane to the Western Front than the Eastern Front, but large amounts of time in the Western Front. In World War I, you have virtually no motion. The war is at a stalemate. So the first real major, and I should say before we move on to the battle chronology, the part of the stalemate too is there's a tremendous spread of disease that happens in the trenches as well. People are in very close proximity. People are wet. People are cold. Have dead bodies strewn all around you, right? So it's very, very unpleasant at a physical level as well as a psychological level as well. And World War I is one of the first wars where we start to notice a tremendous. I'm sure it happened before, but World War I is where you hear the term shell shock, which we now would call post-traumatic stress syndrome. A lot of soldiers were never the same after the war because just the massive amounts of carnage that they witnessed was something that a lot of people were just not prepared psychologically to deal with, and this is a major issue for everyone who goes to war, runs the risk of kind of coming back with dealing with things like that. So the most important battles on the Western Front were the battles of the Marne and Verdun and the Somme River. I have let me check your book here a couple times. I have a tendency to kind of confuse the three of them for some reason. But okay, yeah. So early on, by early September of 1914, you had German forces are right outside Paris, and September 5, the Allies regroup, and they fight the first Battle of the Marne, which is one of the ones where you see there's the kind of the famous scene of. A lot of the French reinforcements being delivered to the battlefield by taxi cabs. They kind of commandeered all the cabs in Paris and used them to go take soldiers to the front. But the first Battle of the Marne turns out to be an Allied victory, and it's the most important victory of the war because it prevents the Germans from knocking France out early. Remember, Germany, geographically, they're in a position where they've got Russia to the east, and they've got France to the west. And the thought was, let's get the French out of there fast, because Russia moved a little slower. Their railroad system was more backward and all that kind of stuff. So the idea was, let's get the French out of there first, and then we can turn our full attention to the Russians. That plan's not going to work out for Germany because they're not able to win the battle at the Marne. So you wind up with this. Huge Russian force amassing on the east, which causes Germany to have to send lots of troops in that direction, leaving a lesser force in the west, and that lesser German force is going to get tied up with the British and French in this very nasty stalemate with the trench warfare that we described, and people trying to go over the top across these hails of fire and all this stuff. And I'm going to try to remember to send you another YouTube clip of from the History Channel showing some actual battle footage of World War I. You can kind of see a little bit of what it looked like. So, probably the high point of slaughter happens in 1916, where so the British forces attack the Germans northwest of Verdun in the valley of the Somme River. One day, 20,000 British soldiers are killed in one day. By the end of the Battle of the Somme in November of 1916, each side had suffered more than 500,000 casualties between killed and wounded. And for all of that, the Germans had gained 4 miles of territory in one spot. The British had gained 5 miles of territory in the other. So again, let's put this for perspective. You know, how many miles is King from Batesburg Walmart? Like what, 7, 8 miles? You would think. So that's about the amount of ground that passed, that changed hands after the end of a multiple months campaign that cost over 1 million casualties. Absolutely insane. And again, why are they doing this? Nobody knows. It takes 30 minutes to explain, and it's ridiculous. People are dying left and right. People that don't die are losing limbs. They're coming back with shell shock. They're leaving widows. They're leaving orphans. They're ruining the economic productivity of their nations in the aftermath. They're unleashing carnage on the countryside. The land physically. I mean, I just get irate when I think about the stupidity of what they were doing in this war. But nonetheless, it happened. So, meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, one thing that happens is that people freeze a lot because it is a really, really cold and nasty conditions there on the Eastern Front. And Russia does not particularly acquit themselves well in World War I. They suffer more. They get out of the war early. They get out over a year before the war is over, and they still had the most casualties of anyone in the war. Lots and lots and lots of Russian soldiers died. Some against the Germans, some against the Austrians. There's a Battle of Tannenberg where more than 30,000 Russians were killed in one battle. And the Russian army was pretty much nearing collapse by 1916. They didn't have enough supplies. They were short on food, they were short on guns, they were short on clothes, they were short on blankets, and they're in the middle of the Russian winter. You can't mess around with a lot of those things, being gone, in a Russian winter. The only thing that the Russians had was numbers, numbers, numbers. They had a lot of people because it's a really big country. It's the largest country in the world, geographically speaking. There's a few countries with bigger populations, but it's a big place. There was a lot of Russians, and they just threw them at the Central Powers, and the Central Powers mowed them down with great gusto. Ultimately, Russia's going to collapse in the middle of the war. We'll talk about that very shortly. But Russia's going to wind up. World War I is kind of going to be the final thing that turns the people against the Russian Tsar and leads to the overthrow of the Russian government, which unfortunately goes in the direction of communist revolution, but not before a brief period of less than a year of a Republican form of government. We'll talk about all that in more detail later. So we'll take a pause. When we come back, we will look at the American entry into World War I and the conclusion of the war.